Imagine being thrown into a pit filled with hungry lions. Not just one or two, but a den packed with these magnificent predators, their golden eyes gleaming in the darkness, their powerful jaws capable of crushing bone like it's nothing. Now imagine walking out the next morning without a single scratch. Sound impossible? Well, buckle up, because the story of Daniel and the lions is about to blow your mind. This isn't just some fairy tale your grandma told you. This is one of the most jaw-dropping, historically documented accounts of faith, courage, and divine intervention that has ever been recorded. And it all starts with a man who refused to compromise, even when his life was literally on the line. Let me take you back about 26 centuries ago to the ancient empire of Babylon. We're talking about one of the most powerful civilizations in human history. Think towering ziggurats, hanging gardens that were considered one of the wonders of the ancient world, and an empire that stretched across the Middle East like a giant claiming everything it could see. This was a place where kings lived in unimaginable luxury, where gold flowed like water, and where political intrigue was basically an Olympic sport. Now, in this world of power plays and backstabbing politics, there was a man named Daniel. But here's where it gets interesting. Daniel wasn't Babylonian, he was Jewish. He'd been taken from his homeland of Judah as a young man when King Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. Imagine being ripped from everything you know, your home, your family, your temple, everything that defines you, and being dragged hundreds of miles away to serve the very people who destroyed your city. But Daniel wasn't just any captive. This guy had something special. He had wisdom that seemed almost supernatural, an ability to understand visions and dreams that left even the most educated Babylonian scholars scratching their heads. He had integrity that was rock solid, never wavering, even when the easy path was right there in front of him. And most importantly, he had an unshakable faith in the God of Israel that would be tested in ways most of us can't even imagine. Daniel rose through the ranks. We're talking about a meteoric rise that would make any career counselor jealous. He served under multiple kings, survived regime changes, and became one of the most trusted advisors in the entire empire. By the time our story really kicks into high gear, Daniel is somewhere in his 80s. Yeah, you heard that right. This is a senior citizen we're talking about, and he's still at the top of his game, still serving with excellence, still maintaining his principles without compromise. The empire had changed hands. Babylon had fallen to the Medes and Persians, and now a king named Darius was running the show. Darius was smart enough to recognize talent when he saw it, and Daniel's reputation was legendary. So Darius organized his kingdom, appointing 120 satraps, which were basically regional governors, to oversee different parts of his massive empire. Over these satraps, he placed 3 administrators, and Daniel was one of them. But here's where Daniel really stood out. The Bible tells us that Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Think about that for a second. An elderly Jewish exile was about to become the prime minister of the Persian Empire. That's like a refugee becoming the vice president. It's absolutely mind-blowing. Now, as you can imagine, this didn't sit well with everyone. The other administrators and satraps were fuming. They looked at Daniel, this foreigner, this outsider, this man who worshipped a different god, and they burned with jealousy. They wanted his position. They wanted his influence. They wanted him gone. So they did what politicians have done since the beginning of time. They started digging for dirt. They began investigating Daniel's work, looking for any mistake, any corruption, any shady deal, any evidence of fraud or negligence. They went through his records with a fine-tooth comb. They examined every decision he'd made, every judgment call, every expense report. They were determined to find something, anything they could use to bring him down. But here's the problem they ran into. There was nothing. Absolutely nothing. No corruption, no negligence, no skeletons in the closet. The Bible says they could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Daniel's life was an open book, and every page was clean. Can you imagine living a life so above reproach that your worst enemies can't find a single thing to criticize? In a world where everyone has something to hide, Daniel's integrity was absolute. His work ethic was impeccable. His character was flawless. These guys must have been going crazy, spending weeks or maybe months trying to find dirt on Daniel and coming up empty every single time. Finally, these frustrated conspirators had a meeting. They sat down together and said something that reveals just how desperate they'd become. They said, and I'm paraphrasing from the book of Daniel here, that they would never find any basis for charges against Daniel unless it had something to do with the law of his God. Think about what they're admitting here. They're essentially saying Daniel is perfect in every way except one. He's too religious. He's too committed to his faith. He won't compromise his devotion to God for anyone or anything, and that, they decided, would be his downfall. So these schemers came up with a plan that was absolutely diabolical in its simplicity. They went to King Darius with flattery dripping from their lips, telling him how great he was, how powerful, how deserving of worship. Then they proposed something that must have appealed to the king's ego. They suggested that he issue a decree stating that for the next 30 days, anyone who prayed to any god or human except King Darius would be thrown into the lion's den. Now, let's pause here and talk about what this law really meant. In the ancient world, kings often promoted themselves as divine or semi-divine figures. It wasn't unusual for rulers to demand worship, or at least ceremonial acknowledgement of their supreme authority. But this decree was specifically time-limited to 30 days, which should have been Darius's first clue that something fishy was going on. The conspirators probably presented this as a loyalty test, a way to unify the kingdom, a method to identify potential troublemakers. And here's the kicker. According to the law of the Medes and Persians, once the king signed a decree, it couldn't be changed. It couldn't be revoked. It couldn't be amended. It was set in stone, or more accurately, sealed with the royal seal, making it absolutely binding. Darius, apparently flattered by the proposal and not seeing through the trap, signed the decree. The moment his seal hit that document, the trap was set. The countdown had begun, and everyone involved knew exactly who their target was. Now, news traveled fast in ancient Persia, and it didn't take long for word to reach Daniel. He heard about the decree. He understood exactly what it meant. He knew that continuing his religious practices would be a direct violation of the king's law. He knew the penalty was death in the most horrifying way imaginable. So what did Daniel do? Did he panic? Did he go into hiding? Did he decide to pray silently in his heart where nobody could see? Did he rationalize that God would understand if he took a 30-day break from his regular prayer routine? Absolutely not. The Bible tells us that when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. Let me emphasize something here that's easy to miss. Daniel didn't pray by the windows to make a public show. This was his regular practice, his established routine that he'd maintained for decades. He prayed 3 times a day, facing Jerusalem, the city where God's temple had once stood. This wasn't defiance for the sake of being defiant. This was faithfulness for the sake of being faithful. Daniel could have closed his windows. He could have prayed in a back room. He could have been more discreet. But that would have been hiding his faith, compromising his witness, allowing fear to dictate his actions. And Daniel had spent his entire life refusing to compromise. He wasn't about to start now, even if it cost him everything. The conspirators were watching, of course. They were waiting for exactly this moment. As soon as they saw Daniel praying by his window, they probably high-fived each other. They had him. The trap had worked perfectly. They immediately went to the king and reminded him of the decree he'd signed. "Oh yes," Darius confirmed, "the decree stands according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." Then they dropped the bomb. They told the king that Daniel who was from the exiles of Judah, that Daniel, who the king trusted more than anyone, was paying no attention to the king's decree. He prays 3 times a day to his God, they said, probably unable to hide their satisfaction. And that's when Darius realized he'd been played. The Bible tells us that when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Can you imagine the king's anguish? He'd been manipulated into signing what amounted to a death warrant for his most trusted advisor, and, because of his own law, he couldn't undo it. Darius tried everything. He probably consulted with legal experts, looking for loopholes. He searched for any technicality that might spare Daniel's life. But the conspirators kept coming back, reminding him that no decree or edict the king issues can be changed. They had him trapped by his own pride, by his own signature, by his own law. As the sun began to set, Darius knew he had no choice. The law was the law, and even the king was bound by it, so the order was given. Daniel was arrested and brought to the lion's den. Now let's talk about what a lion's den actually was. This wasn't a modern zoo enclosure with safety barriers and feeding schedules. This was a pit, probably carved into rock or built with stone walls, where lions were kept. These were working lions, if you will, used for executing criminals. They were kept hungry enough to be dangerous, fierce enough to guarantee that anyone thrown in wouldn't be coming back out. Archaeological evidence suggests these dens had 2 openings. There was a top opening where victims could be thrown in, and a side door at ground level where handlers could enter to feed the lions or remove bodies. Both openings would be sealed with large stones to prevent escape. As Daniel was brought to this den, King Darius spoke to him. The words are recorded in the book of Daniel, and they're absolutely heartbreaking. The king said to Daniel, "May your God whom you serve continually rescue you." Think about what's happening here. The king who signed Daniel's death warrant is now expressing hope that Daniel's God would save him. Darius knew he'd failed Daniel. He knew he'd been manipulated. And in his powerlessness to change the law, he placed his hope in a God he didn't even serve. Daniel was thrown into the den. The stone was brought and placed over the opening. Then Darius sealed it with his own signet ring and the signets of his nobles, so that nothing could be changed concerning Daniel. This double seal was like putting multiple locks on a door. It ensured that nobody could secretly remove Daniel during the night. Whatever was going to happen in that den would happen, without any human intervention. The king returned to his palace, and here's where we see just how devastated Darius was. The Bible tells us he spent the night without eating. He refused entertainment. He couldn't sleep. Can you picture this powerful monarch, this king of a vast empire, pacing through his palace all night, tormented by what he'd been forced to do? Meanwhile, in the darkness of that den, Daniel was surrounded by lions. We don't know exactly how many lions were there, but we know from historical records that Persian kings kept multiple lions for executions. These weren't declawed house cats. These were apex predators, carnivores with instincts honed by millions of years of evolution. In the natural order of things, an elderly, unarmed man in an enclosed space with multiple lions has exactly 0 chance of survival. But something miraculous happened in that den, something that defies natural explanation. The lions didn't attack. They didn't pounce. They didn't even approach Daniel with hostile intent. It was as if an invisible barrier stood between the prophet and the predators, as if an angelic hand held back their jaws, as if the God of heaven had stepped into that den and said, "Not this man, not tonight." The moment the first light of dawn broke across the sky, King Darius was up and moving. The Bible says he got up at the break of day and hurried to the lion's den. He rushed there with a heart probably pounding, dreading what he would find, yet hoping against hope for a miracle. When he reached the den, he called out in an anguished voice. The words recorded in Scripture are so raw, so full of desperate hope. He cried out, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions?" There was a moment, probably just a second or two, that must have felt like an eternity. And then, from inside that sealed den, came a voice, Daniel's voice, strong, calm, and very much alive. Daniel said, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." Can you even imagine the explosion of joy that must have erupted in Darius's heart? His trusted advisor was alive. The man he'd been forced to condemn was speaking to him. The miracle he'd barely dared to hope for had actually happened. The king was absolutely overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. So they pulled Daniel up, and when they examined him, they found not a single wound on him. No scratches from claws, no marks from teeth, no injuries of any kind. The Bible specifically says that not a mark was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Let that sink in for a moment. Daniel spent an entire night in a den full of hungry lions, and he emerged without a scratch. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't Daniel having some secret lion-taming skills. This was God. Period. This was divine intervention, so obvious, so undeniable, that even a pagan king couldn't miss it. But the story doesn't end there. Darius immediately ordered that the men who had falsely accused Daniel be brought before him. These conspirators, these schemers who had manipulated the king and tried to destroy an innocent man, were about to face justice. And in the brutal world of ancient Persia, justice was swift and severe. The king ordered that these men, along with their wives and children, be thrown into the same lion's den. Now, before we even process the horror of this, we need to understand what happens next, because it proves beyond any doubt that what happened with Daniel was supernatural. The Bible tells us that before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Think about what this is saying. These are the exact same lions that spent all night with Daniel and didn't touch him. But the moment these guilty men were thrown in, the lions attacked with such ferocity that their bones were crushed before they even hit the ground. This detail is crucial because it eliminates every natural explanation. Some people might try to say the lions weren't hungry that night Daniel was in the den. Well, they were clearly hungry enough to demolish these men instantly. Some might say the lions were old or sick, but lions that can overpower multiple people and crush their bones before they hit the ground are clearly at the peak of their predatory power. Some might say Daniel got lucky, but luck doesn't selectively protect one person while allowing others to be immediately destroyed. The only explanation that fits the facts is the one Daniel himself gave. God sent his angel and shut the mouths of the lions. Divine intervention, supernatural protection, a miracle. And Darius got the message. This king, who had been manipulated into nearly killing the most righteous man in his kingdom, this ruler who had witnessed firsthand the power of Israel's God, did something remarkable. He wrote a decree to all the nations and peoples of every language throughout the land. and what he wrote was basically a proclamation of faith. Darius declared that in every part of his kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. He proclaimed that God is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, and his dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. A pagan king, a ruler who had just days before signed a decree demanding that people pray only to him, was now commanding his entire empire to reverence the God of a Jewish exile. That's the power of an undeniable miracle. That's what happens when God shows up in such an obvious way that even skeptics can't explain it away. And Daniel? The Bible tells us simply that he prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. This man, who could have lost everything, who should have died that night in the lion's den, continued his faithful service. He continued his 3 times daily prayers. He continued living with integrity and unwavering devotion to God. But here's what makes this story so incredibly relevant, even thousands of years later. Daniel's situation isn't that different from what many people face today. Maybe you're not literally facing lions, but you're facing pressure to compromise your faith. Maybe nobody's threatening to throw you in a pit, but they're threatening your job, your reputation, your relationships, your comfort, if you don't bend your convictions. Daniel teaches us that integrity isn't negotiable, that faithfulness isn't conditional, that devotion to God doesn't take a vacation when it becomes inconvenient or dangerous. He shows us that God sees our faithfulness even when nobody else does, and that he's fully capable of protecting and delivering those who trust in him. Daniel could have rationalized his way out of this. He could have said, God knows my heart, I don't need to pray by the window. He could have said, it's only 30 days, I'll just lay low and then go back to normal. He could have said, I can serve God better alive and in hiding than dead as a martyr. But he didn't, because Daniel understood something profound. He understood that his relationship with God was more important than his life. He understood that compromise is a slippery slope. He understood that faithfulness in small things prepares you for faithfulness in big things. And here's the beautiful part. God honored that faithfulness, not just by saving Daniel from the lions, but by using Daniel's faith to bring glory to his name throughout an entire empire. Think about it. Because Daniel refused to stop praying for 30 days, the God of Israel was proclaimed throughout Persia. Because one man wouldn't compromise, millions heard about the living God who rescues and saves. Your faithfulness matters. The decisions you make when nobody's watching, the integrity you maintain when it would be easier to cut corners, the prayers you refuse to skip even when you're tired or busy or feeling distant from God, all of it matters. You never know when your Daniel moment might come. You never know when your faithfulness in private will become a public testimony to God's power. Daniel's story also shows us that God's protection doesn't always mean God's prevention. God didn't prevent Daniel from being thrown into the lion's den. He didn't strike down the conspirators before they could hatch their plan. He didn't soften Darius's heart in time to change the decree. God allowed Daniel to face the trial. But he was with Daniel in the trial. He shut the mouths of the lions. He protected his servant through the danger, not from the danger. Sometimes we pray for God to take away our problems, to smooth our path, to make life easy. But often, God's plan is to go through the difficulty with us, to demonstrate his power in the midst of our trials, to show that he is sufficient regardless of our circumstances. Daniel didn't avoid the den. He went through it. And he came out with a testimony that has inspired millions of believers for thousands of years. The lion's den also reminds us that our enemies' schemes can become God's platform. These conspirators thought they were destroying Daniel, Instead, they created the perfect setup for God to demonstrate his power. They thought they were writing Daniel's ending. Instead, they were writing his greatest chapter. What was meant for evil, God turned into a showcase of his faithfulness and power. So, when you face opposition because of your faith, when people scheme against you because you won't compromise, when doors close because you took a stand for what's right, remember Daniel. Remember that God can turn your lion's den into a platform for his glory. Remember that the plots of your enemies cannot override the purposes of your God. Daniel's 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, had earlier faced a similar test with the fiery furnace. Now, Daniel faced his own trial. Each time, God showed up. Each time, his people were delivered. Each time, pagan kings were forced to acknowledge the power of Israel's God. There's a pattern here. God uses the faithfulness of his people to reveal himself to the world. And think about the legacy Daniel left. He served multiple kings across multiple empires. He survived political upheavals, regime changes, conspiracies, and assassination attempts. He lived a life of such consistent integrity that even his enemies couldn't find fault with him. He maintained his devotion to God from youth into old age, never wavering, never compromising, never giving up. When Daniel's time on earth finally ended, he left behind a testimony that still speaks today. He left behind prophecies that continue to be studied and marveled at. He left behind an example of faithfulness that challenges every believer who comes after him. The elderly man who emerged from the lion's den became a symbol of God's faithfulness that transcends time and culture. The story of Daniel and the lions isn't just history. It's a declaration that God is still in the business of shutting lions' mouths. Those lions might look different today. They might be cancer diagnoses, financial ruin, broken relationships, overwhelming fear, crushing depression, or impossible circumstances. But the God who shut the mouths of literal lions in ancient Persia is the same God who can shut the mouth of whatever is threatening to devour you today. Daniel's God is still the living God. He still endures forever. His kingdom still cannot be destroyed. He still rescues and saves. He still performs signs and wonders. And he's still looking for people who will trust him completely, who will refuse to compromise, who will remain faithful even when the den is dark and the lions are circling. So, the question isn't whether God can deliver you from your lion's den. The question is whether you'll have the faith to keep praying, keep standing, keep believing, even when the decree has been signed and the stone is being rolled into place. Will you trust that the same God who sent his angel to shut the mouths of lions for an 80-year-old prophet can send his power into your situation? This is the God we serve, the God who sees faithfulness, the God who honors integrity, the God who shows up in impossible situations and does what only he can do, the God who turns enemies' schemes into opportunities for glory, the God who never abandons those who trust in him. And just like he did with Daniel, he's ready to demonstrate his power in your life if you'll simply trust him enough to keep praying, even when the windows are open and the world is watching.